Welcome to episode 2 of Making a Killing, the podcast from Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative on how corruption is reshaping global politics. If you missed our trailer or episode 1, I hope you'll rewind and give them a quick listen, as we took time to spell out what the show's about and what kind of content you can expect going forward. Assuming you've got that background, we've got a fantastic episode for you today. Paul and Casey join me once again to break down some of the big kleptocracy news from this week, from Russia, Georgia, and the US Congress. After that, I'm delighted to host as my first interview guest, Marshall Billingsley, someone who has taken the fight against illicit finance to America's adversaries over the course of a hugely distinguished career. Before his most recent role as Presidential Envoy for Arms Control, he served as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist and Other Illicit Finance at the US Treasury, and he was also President of the Financial Action Task Force, which serves as the global anti-money laundering watchdog. I'm going to be talking to him about the pervasive role of corruption and kleptocracy, taking us around the world to look at some of the most egregious cases from the past few years, many of which you may well not have heard of. What he did in government to counter it, including his thoughts, some of which may surprise you, on some controversial sanctions decisions made in the last days of the Trump presidency. Before we kick things off, please do subscribe to Making a Killing if you've not done so already. You can find us anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And while you're at it, I'd be grateful for a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts if you want to support us and hear more as we unfold the murky and dangerous world of transnational kleptocracy. But without further ado, here's Casey and Paul to help me break down a few of this week's major developments. Welcome to the news section of the show. I'm joined as always by Paul Massaro and Casey Michel to discuss some of the big developments pertaining to corruption and kleptocracy, as well as some of the latest policy work that's going on to try and counter it around the world. This week I've been thinking very much about Biden's various commitments that he's made, the various statements that he's made about prioritizing the fight against transnational corruption, and how the Putin regime has put that to the test, really, quite early on with two kind of big challenges to my mind. The first is obviously the big protests in Russia over the detention of Alexei Navalny, hugely prominent anti-corruption campaigner, opposition leader within Russia, who has exposed, as probably no one else has, the inner workings of Putin's inner circle and the way that they have stolen systematically from the Russian people over the years. And he's done it with great sense of humor, which has engaged the Russian people. So when he returned to Russia after being poisoned by Putin's regime recently, he was immediately detained, provoking widespread protests across Russia, which the prevailing chant by the crowd was "Putin is a thief, Putin is a thief." So the US response was not what I would have done, being someone who's focused on kleptocracy. I think the first State Department's statement mentioned things like vote rigging. It didn't actually mention corruption. But I know there are efforts underway in Congress to issue new sanctions. And in fact, the EU, of all places, just issued its first Magnitsky Act sanctions against some of the Russians officials involved in the detention of Alexei Navalny. So I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on the Navalny protests and the initial response to them.
Yeah, for sure, Nate. I'll jump in here. Paul right here, Helsinki Commission, of course, speaking in a personal capacity. And so looking at these EU sanctions, I mean, this comes on the heels of Joseph Borrell, sort of the high representative of the EU, getting a rather cold reception, to put it diplomatically, in Moscow. He's sort of chased out, and it's a pretty extraordinary
Well, they humiliated
thing.
him, didn't they? They absolutely humiliated him.
Which is really quite extraordinary. I mean, it's one of these things where it seems like Russia is really ready to go to town on the EU. Which hasn't historically been the case. Historically, Russia, of course, has wanted to, has seen the EU as one of these, like, okay, well, we can remain close to the EU while we fight the United States and that sort of thing. And so long as we do that, we'll be set, And I think there are elements within the EU that see it the same way. Of course, this new thing where what was it that Lavrov said? He said, we must now see the EU as an unreliable partner or something of the sort. Right? It's like, oh, now, and so the EU shot back with these Magnitsky sanctions, which, okay, so first of all, really good to see the mechanism used. I mean, it's obviously you want to see these sanctions used. It's not good to just have it in place. You got to see it used. And of course, we all know, we're all very, very, very happy that this was adopted by the EU. of course, it omits corruption sanctions, and that's something I think we want to keep pounding the table on. It's like, okay, well, you're missing half the law here, and we certainly can't synchronize with global Magnitsky sanctions until such a time as the EU adopts corruption sanctions.
That's right. Just for the benefit of listeners who don't know, the Magnitsky sanctions, pioneered by the United States, coming from the Helsinki Commission, allow the US to target human rights abusers and corrupt actors around the world. Other countries are now taking this up, but many of them have left out the corruption limb of that law and are only introducing sanctions regimes based on human rights. So just sorry to jump in, Paul, just in case people think we're going straight into the weeds.
It's just the EU. We've got the UK now with, the foreign minister, Dominic Raab, has basically said, we're gonna bring corruption into this. We're looking for ways to do it. I believe Canada includes it as well. But of course, Canada hasn't used their Magnitsky Act since 2018. There was a great op-ed this morning on that. You're fair enough. We really need to see more aggressive corruption sanctions. Not just because these things are so closely intertwined, but because, as we all know, like, sanctions against corrupt individuals and for corrupt acts just makes a lot of intuitive sense. You stole a lot of money, you put it abroad, and now we can freeze that. It's a pretty powerful thing. So anyway, the EU has hit these four goons involved in the persecution of Navalny, and that's what they are. They're basically just the sort of goons that were given command to, or given the command to, persecute Navalny and imprison him and all that kind of stuff. But these aren't the people behind the scenes. These are not the oligarchs. These are not Putin's cronies. These are not the important people. They're basically extremely low cost, almost a negligible cost individuals that have been sanctioned under the EU regime. And Josh Rudolph, a good friend of all ours, had a great tweet on this. That it's almost worse than nothing. I don't know if I'd agree with that. I think it's good to see sanctions used, but it is a problem. It does signal that the EU is not ready yet or willing yet to go all the way. But then, of course, we haven't used global Magnitsky sanctions either.
Right.
So I would like to see, of course, and Congress, I think generally.
And the protesters and the Russian opposition in exile. That's all they've called.
That's
for.
Right. And we've got the great Navalny 8. Where are the sanctions on the Navalny 8?
There was a further list of 35 that his anti-corruption foundation, 35 instrumental people in Putin's regime that they sent to, the U.S. authorities, and we're waiting for the response. It's felt
delayed. It's felt lackluster. And it's of course hard to complain when the EU is now, in a sense, ahead of the game, ahead of others. So I see Casey wants to say something. Casey, you just got to jump in here and ignore me.
No. Paul, to your point, I think this notion that it is, as Josh mentioned, it is an action. Almost, it seems like for the sake of actions, right? You are sanctioning, a small number of individuals who are relatively behind the scenes or who are primarily within the security services. Okay, fine. Certainly, that is a move that can be applauded, but by no means is it a move of the magnitude of, or a magnitude for which something like a Magnitsky Act, or certainly in the U.S.'s case, global Magnitsky, would have been used for. And I just wanted to turn back to Nate's initial question pertaining to the developments we've seen regarding Navalny, his imprisonments, the protests over the last few weeks. Again, I don't think there's anything that we have seen from Moscow, from the Kremlin's decisions and actions over the last few weeks that's necessarily surprising, whether it's the imprisonment of Navalny, whether it's the sham show trial that we saw resulting, or obviously the crackdowns on protesters themselves. I just wanted to highlight, as Paul just mentioned, this Navalny 8, this kind of elite 8 of figures that Navalny floated and his team floated. Obviously, there were a few dozen more that came thereafter, but these high-level, elite-level, well-known, at least relative to the kind of broader kleptocracy space, names topped by figures like Roman Abramovich, who for years is best known perhaps in the West for owning the Chelsea Football Club, for owning obviously mega yachts, for living the kind of generally wealthy quasi-celebrity, quasi-mogul lifestyle, ingratiating himself into Western polities, obviously most especially in the UK and in London. The fact that Navalny placed Abramovich at the top of the list, and the fact that the rationale behind that is that you can't simply target the security officials. You can't simply target the inner circle, the inner sanctum, whether it's in Moscow, whether it is in Chechnya, those surrounding Ramzan Kadyrov and his entire claque, his entire network. You have to begin going. And this is for the US, this is for Canada, this is for the EU, this is for the UK, this is for Switzerland, after those oligarchs that have taken full advantage of all the services, of all the reputation laundering mechanisms, of all the financial secrecy mechanisms in the West to, again, ingratiate themselves into these Western polities. Abramovich is the perfect case study of this phenomenon. He's by no means the only one, nor is this a phenomenon limited to Russia itself. You have elite-level Kazakhs, elite-level Ukrainians, any range of post-Soviet states, any range of oligarchic castes, networks, authoritarian regimes, you name it. Abramovich is but one, but he is an excellent case study in the kind of dominoes that will need to fall as it pertains to implementing global Magnitsky-related sanctions regimes to their fullest extent. Now, we haven't seen that yet, but it is certainly a signal flare from Navalny and his team. If these programs are to be successful, if they're to achieve what they are meant to achieve, you have to target the Abramoviches of the world. Whether Navalny's in jail or not, that is the name, that is the cast of character you have to go after.
Yeah, I agree, full stop. And I just want to add, very, very shortly that, this Magnitsky, the Magnitsky sort of global movement continues to expand. I mean, you have the EU adopting it now. You've got Australia with a recommendation to do it. You've got Japan considering it. I mean, this even goes beyond Russia. I mean, this has become sort of the tool or one of the top tools to fight kleptocracy. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, and not just Russian kleptocracy, but Chinese kleptocracy and all sorts of other kleptocracy around the world.
Sure. I mean, no, these are great points. I'd love to, and we're going to totally do whole episodes on global Magnitsky and all the rest of it. We got to keep moving because there's so much to talk about this week in our first proper news discussion. So the second thing I was going to talk about, sort of progression. The other big challenge I've been thinking about for the Biden team in the early days posed by Russia, but also posed by the Europeans, is the progression of the Nord Stream 2 project. Again, we've just seen some sanctions issued by the Biden campaign. What are you guys' thoughts on those? It wasn't, Paul, you pinged me earlier just to text me. These are actually mandated by Congress, right? This isn't the kind of like full force thing that they could have done to try and stop Nord Stream 2 if they really wanted to. Perhaps they're leaving the door open for negotiations with the Europeans, whatever it is. And why am I talking about Nord Stream 2 in the vein of on a kleptocracy podcast for starters? But perhaps our readers aren't aware of the sort of backstory to this. But suffice to say, for now, I suppose we can do a proper deep dive later on. But many people call it kind of a pipeline for corruption. It emanates from Russia, and it's become this hugely problematic project and causing a lot of transatlantic tension. But if you guys have any really quick comments on that, because we've got so much more to move on to.
These are mandated by Congress. That's exactly right. These are shall sanctions, right? I mean, this isn't here's the power, go ahead and do it if you want, executive branch. This is like, we're tying your hands.
Right. You
got to do this. This is like the original Magnitsky Act as opposed to global Magnitsky. Every global Magnitsky sanction that's made is at the discretion of the president at the end of the day. Whereas Russian Magnitsky is not. Russian Magnitsky, which is the original Magnitsky Act, 2012, the one that essentially says those involved in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and human rights abuses in Russia have to be sanctioned. That's a shall, and that's the same thing as here. This is a shall. So the administration, I assume, Nate, I assume you're correct. I assume that they are attempting to create an off-ramp of sorts for Germany in the hope that Germany might, of its own accord, back out of the project or end the project, or perhaps they're thinking in terms of, it's just been a really turbulent few years and we really need to repair the relationship with Germany. But I mean, whatever it is, these sanctions have to be enforced. This isn't a choice. This is congressional mandate that they be enforced.
The Biden team, as it is now, has done kind of what it's legally obliged to do anyway, and we await the kind of administration response, as it were. And I think that's a situation we'll have to sort of watch over the next few weeks. And something I think we should address just this week, because it's flared up in a big way, is the situation in the Republic of Georgia, great democratic country. Sort of seen rising protests over the past week or so, allegations of vote rigging, echoing protests in other countries along Russia's periphery, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, for example. And in Georgia, this has also resulted in kind of a crackdown recently, culminating past 24 hours the detention of Nika Malia, the opposition leader who's dragged from his party headquarters. So it's a really dispiriting developments in an otherwise very hopeful democratic country. What does this, again, dear listeners, what does this have to do with kleptocracy? Well, I would sort of say one of the reasons that this situation has arisen because the country's, and correct me if you disagree, guys, but increasingly under the control of one billionaire, one oligarch. In Russia you have a team of oligarchs under Putin. In Georgia and several other countries, there tends to be one big guy, head honcho.
A monogarch. That's what I heard him called before.
Monogarch. That's a great term.
It doesn't make any sense because autocracy is the word for that in the English language, but monogarch, sure.
So in this case, it's Bidzina Ivanishvili. Georgian names are beautiful, but I always struggle with them, I'm afraid. So apologies to our Georgian listeners and his Georgian Dream Party. So you guys got any thoughts on that? What should the US response be there? Is there anything, everyone reaches for sanctions. Is there anything else we can do to assist democratic-minded Georgians as they face this down?
Nate, that's a great question. I mean, this is something that I think to take a step back, obviously, following the 2008 invasion by Russia and the self-declared Moscow-backed independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, Georgia has been at the fore of security concerns in the Caucasus for now over a dozen years. Obviously, there have been very close American and Georgian military relations for going on at least 20 years at this point. There is a very lengthy and steeped and convoluted history of security relations and security concerns in the country. But as it pertains to, and then obviously the 2003 Rose Revolution as well, in terms of one of the primary color revolutions, quote unquote color revolutions that installed democratic governance in the post-Soviet space. The matter with Ivanishvili is that this isn't something that happened overnight. He didn't wake up. I know Ivanishvili, again, is perceived to be, in my estimation correctly, this kind of power behind the throne, or this figure who is, to use a certain metaphor, pulling the strings on a range of politicians. I mean, that's the consensus as it pertains to democratic politics in Georgia. And again, it's a similar dynamic we have seen play out in other countries in the post-Soviet space. But this is a trajectory that Georgia has been on for the last 3, 4, 5 years. We saw anti-democratic arrests even this time last year of those who had spoken out against Ivanishvili, of those who had spoken out against his consolidation of power. This is, again, not something that just flared up overnight. It's also something that the U.S. doesn't seem to have either placed at the fore or placed on, even at the desk of the president necessarily. I haven't seen any commentary as of yet from the president, either in the current administration or the previous administration, let alone from Brussels, let alone from Ottawa, let alone from any other Western partners pertaining to this backsliding, primarily because Georgia continues to maintain very close security relations with NATO. But if the U.S., if the West is unable to place necessary amounts of pressure, either publicly or behind the scenes, regarding Georgia's very clear democratic backsliding, there's only so many things that can be done. We've begun seeing chatter in Washington about potentially placing Ivanishvili under global Magnitsky sanctions. That's certainly a solution. Whether it's the solution, I'm not entirely sure. There are a range of other potential, again, conversations, solutions, policy decisions that can and should be taken. But again, at the end of the day, it's something that does need to be far higher up the ranks of concerns and discussions in Washington, because without American presence, without American rhetoric, there's no reason to think that this backsliding is going to stop anytime soon.
Casey, I think that's right. And it does. I completely agree with the trajectory. This definitely feels like a moment, though. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I do think that this has turned heads in a way that little else has. And I'll say that, the U.S. Embassy in Georgia put out a very powerful statement today. I mean, really like one that I haven't seen language used like this before. I mean, I'll just read this one sentence from it and say, today, Georgia has moved backward on its path toward becoming a stronger democracy in the Euro-Atlantic family of nations. And I mean, that if you know the State Department, that is like 9 out of 10, like that's very, very, very strong. So, I mean, I don't know. It does feel like something's happened here. So,
well, we're running out of time. I just wanted to flag another great thing that came out of the State Department today, which was the recognition, a statement from the Secretary of State himself, recognizing the achievements and bravery of 12 anti-corruption champions from around the world. Again, this is a new thing, and hopefully part of the Biden team's commitment to sort of like supporting people who are combating kleptocracy around the world. So we've basically run out of time. We've got about a couple of minutes left, but I couldn't finish up here without throwing over to you for the final word, Paul, on some amazingly promising legislation that's coming out of the Helsinki Commission from Senator Cardin that I know you've been working on. I wonder if you could just give us a quick summary of what's going on there.
There's so much happening in counter kleptocracy, of course, and there's been these three incredible bills from our presumptive chairman, Senator Cardin: the Countering Russian and Other Overseas Kleptocracy Act, which would enable some amount of FCPA, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, fines and penalties to be recycled into anti-corruption work. The Combating Global Corruption Act, which would mandate a three-tiered report, ranking countries based on their compliance with international anti-corruption norms and standards, and those in the lowest tier would have their leadership evaluated for global Magnitsky sanctions. And then, of course, the global Magnitsky reauthorization, which empowers global Magnitsky by adopting some of the excellent language of the executive order under which it's been implemented, EO 13818. And I also just want to give a shout out to Transparency International USA, which put out a fantastic report just last week that includes, really strong support for all of these bills, and they've been leading a very strong advocacy effort around getting these things passed. So that's of course terrific.
Yeah, it's great to have a Transparency International chapter working away in DC now. But that's all we've got time for today. We're definitely going to have them on to talk about that very soon. But thanks so much, guys. That's all we have time for in our news section. Please stick around though, because next up I will be talking to Marshall Billingsley, one of the top US officials engaged in America's fight against dirty money. He's fresh out of the Trump administration, and he's going to give us his insights on that. Okay, well, hi again, everyone. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined now by Marshall Billingsley. Marshall, welcome to Making a Killing, and indeed welcome to Hudson Institute, because as of this week, we're colleagues now, which I'm delighted and excited to work with you on.
Thanks.
So just to recap for our listeners, I introduced Marshall at the start, but you joined Hudson sort of fresh out of the US government, where you most recently served as Special Presidential Envoy for Arms Control, perhaps more relevantly for what we're about to talk about, also as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and other sorts of illicit finance at the US Treasury. And you also served as president of the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global anti-money laundering watchdog. So it's really great to have you on. Really looking forward to our chat. To kick off, one of the things I'm trying to do with the podcast is help listeners understand just how pervasive the contemporary problem of kleptocracy and corruption is. I think many people still have kind of a narrow interpretation of what a kleptocrat is. They think of Imelda Marcos's shoes or a Russian oligarch flashing around London in a Ferrari with his girlfriend or something like that. But as someone who has worked in government on the full gamut of financial threats, what role do you see corruption and kleptocracy playing in the contemporary global economy? And in particular, how does it sort of create and exacerbate other security problems that we face?
Well, first of all, Nate, thanks for the introduction. It is great to join Hudson, and in particular, I am really excited and appreciative of the opportunity to support all of the great work that you've been doing with the Kleptocracy Initiative. I've listened to your podcasts. I was particularly interested in the nexus between the doping and sporting scandals and the overall corruption environment. I think you've got a strong argument there, and we should pursue that. In terms of your opening question here, I think it's really important that we stress that corruption and kleptocracy is not limited to the so-called third world. This is a phenomena that we find in many countries, including in Europe. There are levels of corruption all over the place, including in the United States. Ultimately, corruption fundamentally undermines the rule of law, and it corrodes society. And when unchecked, it leads to human rights abuses of the most horrific type. It leads to environmental ecocide. It leads to ultimately, when unchecked, the emergence of anti-democratic, either oligarchic or dictatorial regimes. So, I view kleptocracy, the term, to mean that kind of final culminating stage of rampant corruption, where through violence, through intimidation, through highly unethical business behavior, wealth that really belongs to the broader society is amassed and concentrated in the hands of a few. Generally, with kleptocracies, at least in my experience, I found it almost impossible to distinguish between those who govern and those who steal. They basically become one and the same. I think Russia is a good example of this today.
Right. So I suppose the natural next question is, in as much as you can divulge anything from your sort of insights from all your work on this in government and the various bad actors you sort of dealt with, how does contemporary transnational kleptocracy work? You mentioned the role of Western countries, for example, but just taking a very broad view, if you were sort of a young researcher or a young official looking to do something in this area, what are the most serious corruption risks you think are facing us today worldwide, of any kind of nature, really?
Well, there's a tendency, because the international financial system is complex, and the way cash settlement occurs, the way financial transactions move, sometimes it can be a bit daunting, and the wiring diagrams often look like spaghetti charts. I do think it's important that we simplify these issues as best we can. At the end of the day, kleptocracy is basically stealing and looting on a grand scale. So at the heart of any kleptocratic system, there are going to be several basic attributes. And I would say this is not an exhaustive list, of course, but first of all, there is the thing to be stolen. In the third world, very often it's natural resources. In the case of Venezuela, it's been oil and gold.
Yep.
In Congo, everybody's heard about the blood diamond trade. In Uganda, neighboring countries, again, gold. But in other places like Cambodia, it's old growth forests. And in Kenya, Tanzania, it's wildlife trafficking, it's poaching of animals. In other more developed nations, sometimes the thing that is stolen wouldn't necessarily be a natural resource. It often is either a business enterprise or a basic service to society. Let me give you some examples. Lebanon, before the collapse of the economy there, despite having one of the most robust banking sectors in the world, there was no potable water and no reliable electricity, despite years and years and years and billions invested. That money was being siphoned off and diverted to other purposes. In Russia, it really has come down to the seizure of companies and putting those assets under the control of Vladimir Putin's cronies. But for instance, in Latvia, a NATO ally and a Baltic nation, when we designated an oligarch there by the last name of Limburgs, his basic business model, among other things that he was doing, such as intimidating people out of politics, was he was running the port system and the logistics infrastructure. Or back to Venezuela, you see theft from humanitarian assistance, the so-called clap boxes, which I'd like to do a special deep dive with you in the coming days, because I view the use of corruption in the food in food aid as among the most horrific types of theft.
Yep.
But there was an entire scheme to basically devalue the national currency, to siphon money off from that. In Malaysia, with the 1MDB scandal, it was the theft of billions from a fund that was ostensibly meant to develop the country for the people. So those are the things to be stolen. Then there are the actions that are associated with the theft. And this ranges from bribery of government officials to look the other way, violence against those who try to stop the theft, including assassination of investigative journalists and government officials, intimidation and the like. And ultimately what you see, Nate, is when unchecked, there's a collapse of law and order, and everyone starts engaging in corrupt actions, often just to survive. And when it gets to a failed state situation like we now have in Venezuela, corruption is the economic model. One final point on this. With kleptocratic regimes, these are by definition institutionalized operations, which means they rinse and they repeat. They don't stop. And what that means is there become highly evolved supply chains that move the commodity out, and sophisticated financial transfer mechanisms Now, we often call it money laundering, but very often at the outset, that money flows out fairly brazenly and fairly transparently. It's only when attention gets called to the crimes, or when the bad actor, like Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos, have accumulated so much wealth that they can't possibly spend everything they've stolen, that they then start thinking about how they're actually going to live long enough to spend it. Mm-hmm. And that means they want anonymity. That means they want the ability to move around undetected. And so that's when you begin to see establishment of money laundering networks that rely on front companies that are in offshore banking jurisdictions. It means getting passports that would allow you visa-free travel to the US or Schengen, or even better, EU citizenship. It also means buying things so that you can move around undetected, so to speak. And that's things such as yachts and private jets, so that you can get back and forth to the overseas mansions where you've parked all your wealth, whether that's in Limassol, Cyprus, or for the Russians, or in Spain or Portugal, or Texas or Florida for the Venezuelans. So those are just a few of the attributes that I think people digging into kleptocratic regimes and systems would find largely in common across the board.
Thanks so much. You gave us an amazing sort of global tour of kleptocracy over the past few years there. And one thing that, as you were speaking, a sort of additional question that popped up to my mind is, how do you think the rise and the emergence of China as a global economic force, and the kind of economic policies that it pursues, the way it operates, how has that affected corruption risks around the world? I mean, one of the things that's kind of shocked me just in the past few years of working on this issue, and you have a much longer level of experience than I do, is just the way that corruption has been turbocharged along the Belt and Road. There's so many cases sort of popping up there. So just any comments you have about that, I'll be fascinated.
Well, the rise of China, and China is, as you mentioned, I was president of the Financial Action Task Force, and I handed off the presidency to a Chinese official member of their central bank. But I must say that China is part and parcel of the problem. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean the PBOC, but I do mean the predatory business behaviors of Chinese state-owned enterprises around the world. Yep. You mentioned Belt and Road and the use of debt traps. At the end of the day, we see Chinese enterprises engaged in all manner of fraudulent behavior, of bribery, as they work their way into systems. Moreover, we find that often the state-owned enterprises are really very much interested in those natural resources that I mentioned at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so when they've pushed their way into these countries and start targeting the extractive business operations, whether we're talking about timber or minerals in particular, or oil, we don't find that the Chinese state-owned enterprises are transparent, and we don't find that, in fact, they are a force for fighting corruption. And moreover, China is the end destination and the most heaviest, consumer of some of these ill-gotten gains, particularly in the wildlife trafficking business. And then finally, I would just say that having worked to try to get the Chinese to implement other UN-mandated sanctions regimes, such as on North Korea, their banking sector is not transparent, and the government really works overtime to avoid enforcing many of these kinds of sanctions measures. So the rise of China is going to greatly complicate and exacerbate this problem unless they change their ways.
As mentioned, you're fresh out of the Trump administration, where you held a number of senior roles. In terms of combating illicit finance and kleptocracy, there's lots of people sort of have there's controversial views over President Trump himself, but the administration undoubtedly took a number of really important steps in this regard during the past 4 years. And so I just wondered if you could walk us through some of the things that you're particularly proud of, some of the actions, achievements that you implemented to take on the kleptocrats and other bad actors.
Yeah, it is really one of the less understood set of accomplishments that we were able to achieve with the president's support under the previous administration. Under President Trump, we launched the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program, and we've been encouraging other nations to follow our lead, and they are now starting to do so, as we've seen in recent days. We held accountable under that program alone more than 100 people in networks around the world, including human rights abusers and corrupt officials in Nicaragua. I mentioned Venezuela, but Iran, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Myanmar, among others. Some of our targets include, for instance, Maung Maung Soy, who oversaw the military operations in Burma's Rakhine state, which led to what I view as genocide against the Rohingya civilians. They were shooting civilians, they were raping women, and there were all kinds of Burmese military commanders and units involved in the ethnic cleansing and the other widespread human rights abuses. And I mention that because Myanmar is now, of course, back in the news with the military coup that just has occurred. Mm-hmm. But our other actions include measures against high-profile, prominent international businessmen, such as Dan Gertler, mm-hmm. Who amassed a fortune through hundreds of millions of dollars of opaque and corrupt mining and oil deals in the Congo, and really looting the wealth of that country. It was directly because of our sanctions actions against Gertler that we deterred his partner in crime, Laurent Kabila, from trying to change the constitution in the Congo. And that then led to elections and to Kabila's ouster and the return to some semblance of democracy in that country. I want to come back to Gertler in a minute, because in recent days, I, alongside many others, have learned of a last-minute reversal mm-hmm. by the Trump administration of the Gertler sanctions through a license being issued by OFAC. Yeah. And that is something I hope the Biden administration will move swiftly to repeal and to reimpose those sanctions on Gertler, because his behavior is truly appalling, as is the issuance of that license by OFAC, in my view.
I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you raised it when you brought up Dan Gertler.
I was astounded to see mm-hmm. that occur, and I believe that many of the fine career policy makers in the Treasury were completely blindsided mm-hmm. by that action. I must say, Nate, I'm particularly proud of our efforts to combat the Maduro regime's efforts mm-hmm. to undermine democracy in Venezuela. I mean, the rapaciousness of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores knows no bounds. They've impoverished millions. They've created an unprecedented migration crisis in Latin America and the United States, in the Western Hemisphere. They have driven Venezuela's oil industry into the ground. You can see from space the man-made lakes full of mercury, red mercury, where they're processing, ripping gold out of the jungle. It's mm-hmm. ecocide on a horrific and mammoth scale. And there must be a price to pay for these people abusing human rights, and we must prevent them from accessing our financial system to launder their ill-begotten gains. And you can look around the world. I'm also very proud of the many actions we took against Hezbollah financiers, particularly those who are preying upon the weak and helpless in Africa. One of the most egregious that stands out in my mind is what Mohammed Ibrahim Bazi was doing in the Gambia together with the dictator there, Jaja Jammeh. And basically the scheme there, how that was working was Bazi got a monopoly over electricity production in the Gambia, in exchange for which he was furnishing underage girls to the dictator in a human trafficking network. Truly outrageous behavior. Mm-hmm. Or, another Hezbollah financier, Salah Assi, who was running the largest bakery in the Democratic Republic of Congo and was fixing the price of bread. I mean, truly horrific stuff here. And of course, in that case, you're talking about two financiers who are funneling a portion of their corrupt proceeds back to the terror operations of Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I suppose on that note, you're sort of looking forward, you mentioned you'd like to see the Biden administration reimpose those Gertler sanctions. But there's so much more low-hanging fruit. There's so much more to do, right? You had these amazing achievements, but what would you like the Biden administration to kind of do next in terms of America's fight against kleptocracy, illicit finance, and also, if necessary, the 117th Congress? Because there are some loopholes and things that need legislation. So, if you have any thoughts about that as well, I'd be fascinated to hear.
Well, so I think keeping it simple. I hope the Biden administration follows our lead and builds mm-hmm. on our lead. It's vogue these days for incoming administration officials to denigrate or downplay the progress that we made under the Trump administration, try to tear down their predecessors' achievements in order to make their own accomplishments seem more significant. I hope they don't do that when it comes to our work fighting corruption and targeting human rights abuses. This is a nonpartisan issue. It shouldn't be politicized. Our administration, I think, unquestionably was the most aggressive in fighting corruption in U.S. history. We did many things that those before us tried but were unable to do, such as getting the beneficial ownership registry established in law, bringing into force the global Magnitsky sanctions. We've left an excellent foundation, I think, for the incoming team. I hope they take advantage of that. But I must say, Nate, it's not at all clear to me that even with everything we did under the previous 4 years, I'm not sure we're winning the fight against corruption. I think it's essential we double down. And so I hope that the Biden administration will, in fact, be more aggressive, more active, that they will apply greater pressure through the Financial Action Task Force and bilaterally through our relationships to try to clean up and clean out these jurisdictions. It is a never-ending fight, but it's one that we may, in fact, be losing ground on. Not to end on a pessimistic note, but I think when it comes to the 117th Congress, as you asked, I do hope, and I will urge my friends and colleagues on the Hill to be supportive of any effort that the Biden administration takes to combat kleptocrats and corruption. There are times when the Congress feels that it's being helpful, particularly when they try to impose mandatory sanctions. I think that, in fact, I would urge that they not do that, resist that temptation. When you do that, you're basically tipping the hand. And these folks like Gertler, highly sophisticated, legions of lawyers and accountants, if they see the sanctions coming, the money will be gone before the Treasury can get to it. So the element of surprise and the ability to negotiate behind the scenes with foreign jurisdictions to take care of the problem through a much wider arrangement or set of mechanisms than just sanctions alone, that flexibility is going to be very important to give to the Biden team.
That's great. And I guess I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. So maybe one more thing we could talk about. Your actions at Treasury, but also the broader trend of anti-kleptocracy efforts over the past few years, from the Panama Papers to 1MDB, have shown that it really takes a global network to take down global networks. So who are you mentioned bilateral relations, who are the democratic allies you think we should be working more closely with on this issue? But also, who are the sort of civil society groups and independent media organizations you think we should also be supporting? You mentioned this when we talked the other day, and I'd love to hear your final thoughts on that.
In particular, our NATO allies. Now, of course, NATO's a collective defense organization, but we have very, very strong connections, not just between our State Departments and foreign ministries and our defense and ministries of defense, but also between the finance ministries and the financial intelligence units. And I think that the collaboration that occurred, for instance, with Canada and with a number of other like-minded nations, Colombia and others, to track down Argentina at the time, to track down Maduro's finances, stands out as an excellent model for collaboration. So we have to go beyond our European friends. We will need to continue to work with Europe, particularly London, as they, with Brexit, now are standing apart and independently from the EU regulations. We need to work with the UK to make sure that London really ceases to be a major haven for third-party money launderers. We also must work with Germany and France as those financial centers will take on additional importance in the new post-Brexit environment. One of the things that our experience in Latvia and Cyprus and Malta and elsewhere shows us is that there are some gaps in the regulatory frameworks that are necessary, particularly when a bank is determined to be engaged in systemic money laundering. Who exactly is responsible for putting a freeze on those banks, revoking the license, and liquidating the assets? So there's quite a bit of work to be done in that respect. Non-governmental organizations and investigative journalists are also of vital importance in this fight. And so we absolutely should look to both human rights groups, whether we're talking, for instance, about the Sentry, and John Prendergast, who's done phenomenal work with his team in Africa.
Yep.
We're talking about a number of Venezuelan human rights groups or groups focused on Nicaragua, or all of the investigative journalists who really dig into these different corruption schemes, whether it's the golden passport schemes. We've seen in recent days protests erupting in Cyprus over that scheme. There's just enormous work to be done, and it is through a coalition of like-minded individuals, whether they happen to be in government or at think tanks like Hudson or in other non-governmental organizations. Like-minded individuals have to pool their knowledge, their insights, and collaborate on ways to really root out and clean up these environments.
Well, that's fantastic. And I think unless you have any further thoughts, Marshall, that's about all we have time for today, sadly. So I want to welcome you again to Hudson and to Making a Killing. Hopefully, I'm not going to drag you on every week like I do with Casey and Paul, but hopefully you'll be a repeat guest because you have so many insights to offer, and I'm deeply grateful for you being my first interview guest today.
Thanks, Nate. Great to talk, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Great, thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Making a Killing. If you're enjoying the show, please do make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and again, a 5-star rating is deeply appreciated in spreading the word. If you'd like to hear more about the Kleptocracy Initiative or the Hudson Institute, please visit hudson.org. Sadly, that's it for this week, but I'll see you next time.